Something that should be questioned that I find usually is not questioned is the idea of representation, particularly in the context of politics and what's called, a constitutional republic, or when people talk about democracy. There's this idea that you are actually being directly represented by others. So those others are not ruling over you, they're actually just carrying out your will. So, first of all, if you vote for someone and that person loses, and someone else wins the election that you do not agree with, how are you then being represented? Right? So, just on that simple level, the issue of representation, I think, is fair to call questionable, right? Because if you can't actually choose who your so-called representatives are, right? Like if it's possible who you vote for, who you choose, can lose the election, right? So then that means you're not actually able to choose your representative, right? So if you're not able to choose your representative, how are you being represented, right? I think that's a fair question. So this article I just got in my inbox, which is very just pro state, kind of pro status quo, has included this 1828 Webster's Dictionary definition of the word republic, which is, quote, a state in which the exercise of the sovereign power is lodged in representatives elected by the people, end quote. And then the author of the article goes on to say, when someone protests the flag, what they are effectively saying is, I don't want to be king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in ruling myself, end quote. So I invite you just to look at this objectively. Like, try and just think about what's being said here and forget about, any kind of patriotic sentiment you may have for a moment. If you can just put that aside and just think about what's being said here. A system where I participate in ruling myself, right? So, why would you need to participate in a system in order to rule yourself, right? Again, I think that's a fair question. Why can't you just rule yourself on your own? Is that a ridiculous question? I don't think so. Why can't you rule yourself? Are you incapable of ruling yourself? If you are capable of ruling yourself, which I imagine you are, then why would you need to participate in a system that sort of roundabout rules yourself through representatives, which again, as the 1828 dictionary definition of republic makes clear, are deemed representatives based on their being elected, right? So this is, again, assuming that you voted for who was actually elected, right? But obviously, elections aren't won by one candidate. You know, no candidate ever gets 100% of the votes, right? So all of the people that did not vote for that candidate, right? They did not get to choose their representative, right? This is pretty basic, right? I don't think I'm saying anything irrational. So if the basis of just government is representation, but you aren't actually at all guaranteed representation, then how is that just, right? If the whole supposed ethical basis is this idea of the consent of the governed and being represented, well, what about all the people, again, that voted for the person that lost? Or what about if there was no candidate that you felt represented you because you wanted to just rule yourself? Where is, the option for those that want to actually rule themselves? This idea that if you're against government, you're saying, as this article does, I don't want to be king anymore. Like, you got to admit, I think anyone, intelligent, just basic rationality would have to admit that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. If you're against being governed, that isn't equivalent to saying I don't want to be king anymore, right? It's actually the opposite, right? Because a king is a sovereign. So if you're saying I want to be king, over my own life, you're saying I want to be sovereign, right? So by giving up your sovereignty to be ruled over by so-called representatives is not equivalent to saying I want to be king, right? It's just technically false, right? I mean, you can try and twist the words and, put it into some theoretical framework, that you'll find in like a university political science class, but it's just technically incorrect. It's a false equivalency to say if you're against being governed, you're saying I don't want to be king, because people that are actually not interested in government would say I do want to be king, right? I want to be a sovereign person. I am a sovereign person, right? So I point this out because this reasoning presented in this article, this idea of representation and consent of the governed, and that you're actually ruling yourself by being governed, like, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's not actually technically accurate, right? So therefore, the basis of so-called, civilization, the basis of this entire system is baseless. There's nothing actually solid there. It's just, you could say, sleight of hand. It's just basically deceptive language, right? So something to keep in mind. And, there's also the issue of that even if you vote for someone who seems to represent you in important ways, on like major issues, what's to stop that person from changing course post-election, right? Like, that has certainly happened before. It's not like it's a wild theory. Sometimes politicians say one thing during a campaign and then do another thing after the election, right? Like, that certainly has happened before. And, as far as election integrity, You look at elections globally throughout history, it's correct to say they are not always carried out, honestly, right? There's fraud that occurs. I think it was Stalin, maybe, who there's a quote from where he said, it's not the votes that matter, it's who counts the votes that matter, kind of thing. Right? So, like that, there definitely has been that problem, here in the States and elsewhere. So, again, that would undermine representation. So, how do you prevent that? How do you prevent politicians from being deceptive and telling you one thing and doing another? How do you prevent election fraud, from ever occurring? And how do you just prevent your candidate from losing the election? The person that represents you from losing. Like there's no real way to stop any of these things. So it's just very problematic, to put it mildly. And yeah, it's just inaccurate. Like I said, it's a false equivalency, this idea that if you're saying, I'd rather not be governed, that you're saying, I don't want to rule my own life. Again, that's not only a false equivalency, but it's actually the opposite of the truth, right? Anarchy, the root meaning of the word is an, meaning no or non, and then archy, ruler, no ruler, right? So, philosophical anarchism is about not being ruled and instead ruling yourself. In other words, being, king of your own life, being your own sovereign being. So this idea that you're renouncing your own kingship if you renounce being ruled over by so-called representatives, it's just completely false, right? So that's a shadow banned insight right there for you. All right, thanks for listening.